Next, we'll be looking into one of the important concept of ReactJS, that is components. So what are components and why do we need to have a better understanding of it, right? So components are nothing but the smallest visual element on the UI, right? So it's a visual block which is occupying some space on the web page. And previously we used to maintain entire web page as one file, and we didn't have the concept of components. Now, what is component is it is the strategy to divide the UI page into multiple components so that we get the separation of concern. So now what data this component has to display, it is only the concern of that component. And if you want to display the same component in another place, you can just import that component using the JavaScript module system. You can export and import a component. So with the help of component, you are able to get the separation of concerns, so you don't have to worry what is 2 and what is 3. You can write and implement your own component. Reusability is quickly possible, so if component 1 has to be used somewhere else, you can just export and import. And also when you render, so when you look at the DOM tree of the component, so it looks pretty clean like this. Your UI tree is like this. So whatever hierarchy you maintain inside component 1, you are putting component 2 and component 3, etc. Right? So components are nothing. It's the visual elements on the browser. But you need to understand more about components, like what are the different types of component do we have, and what are the properties associated with it, and what are the complexities it is associated with it, right? So let's look into that, right? So first, so there are certain rules and certain concepts with respect to components. So first thing is there are two types of components. Okay, two types of components. One is functional components and other is class components. So we will see what is the difference and why do we have two different types of components. Why can't we just get the work done with the functional components or class components, right? So first of all, what is component in terms of programmatic understanding, right? So normally it is a visual UI element on the browser, right? So component is nothing but a JavaScript function which is returning React element or JS6 or HTML. So you can simply say a JavaScript component which is returning HTML content. That's it. So how do you differentiate the component and a normal JavaScript function? Because both the same way we are writing both, like we are just defining the function and returning some element. And the same way this can also be written in the form of arrow function as well. So this. So how do you convert an arrow function into a normal function to arrow function? You write this, and since it has multiple statements, you simply do return and all of these content, right? So both of these are normal JavaScript functions, but why are we mentioning it as components? Because they are returning the JSX elements, right? And one important thing which you need to remember is a component should always, component name should always start with a capital letter. Always start with a capital letter. So that is the rule which React guys have imposed on, so that they'll differentiate. I mean, good pattern, like everybody will follow that component name should start with capital letter, right? So we'll deep dive into these two understandings, what is class components and what are functional components. But what else are components? What is the other properties of component? So first, it is a JavaScript function which is returning the React element or HTML content. it should start with capital letter, and a component receives an argument by default which is injected by the ReactJS, and we call it as props. So by default, every component receives an argument that is called as props. So what is props? What are props? Props are the data elements which ReactJS can inject, and we as a developer or an engineer, we can inject the props data. So if you want to pass any data from one component to another component which are under the same hierarchy, so from component here, if you see, if I want to pass any data between component 1 to component 2, then I can send it as a props. So data from 1 to 2 can be passed down as props. You cannot pass the other way, only in the one-word direction, in the downward direction. So component 1 can pass the data to component 2 and component 3, but component 2 and component 3 cannot pass props as data. Okay, so these are the things which you need to keep in mind. Name should start with A, and it always should return a React element and a React element or a single React element. What is the difference between this? I'll explain. Single React element. So what I meant to say is that you cannot do this. Hello world. Another hello world. Okay. So see, it already started throwing the errors. Okay. So if I hover, what it is saying, JSX parent expressions must have one parent element. So now what is happening is this particular component is not returning one element. It is returning two JSX elements, right? So how do we solve this? Or why do we, what exactly the problem is? So any JavaScript function, any JavaScript component can actually return only one element. So like this. So if you want to return multiple divs, you just put it under this. Now this is allowed because it is only returning one JSX component. Okay. So if you want to return two elements like this, obviously when you write code, you'll come across a situation where you have a lot of divs and you cannot do this, right? So this was the negative in the very starting stages, but now we have got a new feature called as React fragment. So technically when you do this, a new div is being appended to the browser, right? So maybe that will disturb your CSS, or maybe you don't want to do it because it is an unnecessary div because of the limitation of React, right? So in that cases, you can use React fragment. So if you don't put any element like div or h1 or p, you can just omit all of those. And when you do this, so this is called as React fragment. So what is a React fragment? Fragment is nothing but something which looks like this. So it doesn't return or doesn't append any of the HTML element on the browser, but it just satisfies the needs of ReactJS. Okay, and either the syntax is either you can write this way or you can write react.fragment. So this is called as react.fragment. Okay, so second thing which we need to remember is components should always return a single JSX element. If needed, you can wrap the element inside fragment. So this is one more thing which you need to keep in mind, right? And now what we'll do is we understood that there are two types of components, that is functional components and class components, right? So what are the differences between these two? So a functional component, the syntax to define a functional component is this way. Now we'll convert the same functional component into class component. So it means now you will use the syntax of this new JavaScript feature, that is class app class component. So I'm just converting this function component into class component. So how do I write it? Class app class component, so whatever name you want to give to your component, and then extends, so it will extend react dot component. So a functional component is now being converted to I'm just showing how you can convert a normal functional component into class component. So this class component will contain a render method, okay, a render method, and this render method returns the exact content of what the functional component used to return. Okay, so it is render, and the class component should have a constructor. Okay, the render method should return. So the syntax is the render method should return the JSX elements. So if you simply see, the difference between these two is nothing. So whatever you used to return in the normal JavaScript function component, the same content is now returned from the render function of the class component. So there is a render function inside that. Okay, so this is the way you convert a normal functional component into class component. Now the question arises, why do we need, if both are doing the same thing? So let me show you. So I'll export both of these from this file. Okay, so function app, okay, and function. So I don't even have to do it in the bottom. So I can simply say export. Okay, so where am I importing it? Over here. So it is not a default export anymore. So I should simply put it in the flower brackets and app class component, right? So now I'll be rendering. So in the main base index.js file, again you need to wrap it, you need to pass these two components. So see, if I am using a React custom component, how am I using it? You just put the angular brackets and the component name with the closing backslash, right? So now if I see my UI, right, so it contains both hello world and another hello world, one from the functional component and the other from the class component. So let me differentiate that. So yeah, this is functional component and this is class component. Okay, functional component and class component. So again, when you want to convert a functional component, so the main difference is that the functional component, whatever the content the functional component is returning, now inside the class component you will return it from the render function. Okay, now what is the difference between these two and why do we need two types of components, right? So the main thing is that class component has the power of state. Okay, so functional components doesn't have the power of state. And also, so let me note it down. Functional components does not have access to state, or lifecycle methods. We'll discuss what is these two, state and lifecycle methods. Okay, whereas class components have access to both state and lifecycle. Okay, now what is these two? Okay, in a simpler terms, functional components are dumb throughout their life. So functional components are dumb throughout their life. It means they do not have their own data. They always depend on the data which is passed from one component to the another component. Okay, functional components are dumb throughout their life. So it means they doesn't have any state. So state means data owned by that components. So every component can have their own data, like profile component can have the profile data which is being fetched from the backend. But in terms of functional and class components, functional components can never have access to the state. So it means it is going to remain as dumb, and there is no way you can change the data inside that component by itself. If you want, if some component above it, the data is changing and it is being passed as props, then only the functional component will change. Okay, so we'll see more about state and life cycle. But why do we have both class and functional components? Because class components have the power of state and lifecycle method, which we will discuss how to define the state and how we can use the lifecycle methods going forward. Okay, so now the other concept which you need to know is component composition. So it is component composition. So what is this? So it is using one component inside another. So how you can use one component inside another? You must be already aware of it. Now, if I don't want to export this, okay, if I don't want to export this and I want to use this class component over here, so how can I do that? Simply angular bracket, close and done. So now I'll remove this because it will throw error again, and I'll also remove this. Okay, yeah, so I'll pull this component to the top. Yeah, so now I'm using one component in another component. This is called a component composition. Okay, so whenever you want to access another React component which you have defined, you simply do this. So you put the angular brackets and the component name and \. That's it. So this is called as component composition. So see, now you get to see the same thing which we have seen before. Okay, now we will define some state, and we will define how we can use the state and what are the properties of state and everything, right?